All right. So it's been a long time since I have done a episode, and a lot has happened. So before I do the book review, I'm gonna go ahead and just do a quick synopsis of what's been going on. So I changed jobs twice last year, and my life got pretty hectic during that time period. Now, the second job that I got is the job I currently have, and it's been an adjustment getting used to the work environment here because this is a different kind of property that I've ever worked at before. So I did all of this while maintaining kind of a rocky period in my relationship at the time. Um, but we have stayed together through all of that. And it became a situation where, as soon as I moved into my new apartment, um, our drummer in our band ended up not working out. So uh, we we being me and Clint ended up like really focusing on trying to relearn a lot of the songs that we've written from our previous albums. And then we started working on the acoustic album that we want to do. And then while we were working on the acoustic album, I was simultaneously starting to record guitar tracks for our fifth album. So all of that happened from January to October. And then once I moved into my apartment in October is whenever we started recording and relearning our old songs, and then started recording the fifth album. So not only were we recording the acoustic album, but we were also recording our fifth album. And then in that period, it was like a month or two, and we got a new drummer and a new guitar player. So things have been moving very fast for us as a band. And then as soon as we got our new drummer and guitar player, I think we had like 3 practices, and then they decided that they wanted to have go on another tour. So if you know anything about booking tours, it's a really long process, and it usually takes about 3 or 4 months of just sending emails trying to get available dates and stuff. Even for small tours, it can be kind of chaotic, especially since it's just me. I'm just one person and I'm doing this. So we booked the tour, then we had to organize all the finances for the tour. And then we had to talk between all the band members and talk about logistics of the tour and how we were going to go about doing that. So as you can see, it's already been kind of chaotic just from January to like, I don't know. When did I guess it was like I guess it was like the end of February. So from October of 2023 until about the end of February is whenever we finally got the tour booked. And so I moved into my apartment, and then like 2 or 3 months later, we got John and Jordan in the band. And then it was like the middle of January, after we had like 3 practices, that we were like, all right, we're going to go on tour now. So by March, we were kind of discussing all of the logistics and stuff. And then in April was whenever we really started to prepare. And now we're in May. We're in the middle of our tour right now. So we already did the Texas leg of the tour. We've got a show in Denton this Saturday at a house venue, and then on the Sunday coming up, we're also doing a live session. So now that the tour is like halfway over almost, because we're still going out to California for the second time at the end of the month, so next week. And once we get there, we're gonna kind of take like a month off, because now my girlfriend's gonna be moving in into my apartment. So it's definitely been chaos. But we will definitely be able to do more as far as the podcast is concerned. I will be moving to Austin fairly soon, though. Probably after the summer, leading up until following January. So it's going to be like maybe 3 months after August, give or take, before I will know for sure if I will have a job to transfer to over there, because I'm going to stay with the company that I'm at currently. I'm just going to transfer to Austin. But let's see what else has happened. So I built a studio in my new apartment, and so I've got a rehearsal space now. I've been playing drums a lot more. I finally have a kind of a controlled place to record guitar. I also built a studio in my garage that I have as well. So I have a garage, and I built it so that I can record guitar and drums there as well. It's not completely finished, just because I have some more things I would like to buy for it. I kind of have run out of money right now, and I don't want to invest more money until I'm realistically able to do that, because I also want to get rid of my drum set. I want to get a new drum set and buy some more pieces for it, because right now I'm just kind of using like a bottom of the line kit that I have learned how to play on, which is cool, but I'm getting a little bit better at drums and would like to actually record some demos stuff with drums, and maybe even play drums in a band again. I would kind of miss playing drums in a band. So that also simultaneously happened in between October and January. So I like doing these podcasts. I like dedicating more time to reading books and doing book reviews. I just haven't realistically had the time to dedicate towards it just yet. So I appreciate anybody that ends up listening to this, because I have not been pushing the podcast very much at all. And I haven't even been doing very much with the After Dark podcast. I haven't done an episode this year. So I'm hoping after we get back from tour, I can schedule episodes for that as well. I would also like to continue doing episodes even after I move to Austin, just because I know so many bands here in this area, and I think we have a way to record on the weekends now, so I will be following up and doing that as well. I've also started a project with our guitar player's dad. He fixed my guitar. I got a new guitar that's like my dream guitar. I'll show it to you real quick. It's this guitar. It's an Albert Lee. This version is a Sterling, but the original is a Music Man, and it's got a really cool story. But I found it at a pawn shop here in Denton for $180, and this is typically a $600 guitar. So, it's pretty amazing. Now, I was actually talking to Jordan's dad because he actually is the one who helped set this up. He also replaced the pickups because this is a humbucker style guitar, but it's really interesting and it never worked right as soon as I got it, so he ended up fixing it so I could actually use it the way it's supposed to be intended. But this switch here is a 5-position switch, which is pretty abnormal for humbucker style guitars because typically single coil guitars have the 5-position switch because you can switch from the different single coil setups. But if you know anything about Albert Lee was actually a recording musician who recorded for Buddy Holly. He also recorded for Eric Clapton. He recorded for a couple of other pretty well-known artists in the blues community. But he also had a solo project that got really popular really quick, and then he just like stopped doing it and started doing recording stuff as well. But he kind of revolutionized the way that blues music was played because his playing style was so unique. He was really good at finger picking, and so that kind of characterized a lot of his sound. And he played mainly Strat guitars. So the original version of the Albert Lee is actually 3 single coils on the guitar pickup. Now, they made this humbucker version, which he never really plays the humbucker version, but the humbucker version got really popular whenever it came out. I want to say in like the early 80s. I'm not entirely sure on that. It might be like the late 70s, early 80s. But the humbucker style got really popular. But they made the humbucker version pretty unique because they kept the 5-position switch. So you can use this 5-position switch to actually only use one single coil out of the humbucker like you can on a Strat guitar, which works really well because with my band, a lot of the songs that I've recorded have been with a Telecaster or a Strat, which are like the main guitars that I've played most of the time throughout this band. So I can actually mimic my Telecaster sound immediately by using kind of a non-traditional switch position because you can't really mimic that on a humbucker on most guitars. So it sounds amazing, and Jordan's dad is the one that set this up. And so I'm just gonna put this over there. So I had this idea for a guitar amp probably about, I don't know, 5 years ago, but I just never really followed up with how it could actually be done because I just thought, well, there's no way that this would actually work. I don't even see how it would work. But my idea kind of developed more rapidly in the past couple of months. So my idea was to have a dual clean channel guitar amp because I never use the distortion channel on my guitar amps, mainly because they don't sound very good and I already have pedals. So I ended up talking to him, and we're doing some more research on how to actually make it work. But I discovered that the guitar amp used on Nirvana's In Utero, which is one of my favorite albums, all of the clean channel guitar tones were done using a Marshall 100 watt plexi amp from like the 60s that was modified by some random guitar tech in Seattle, and the guitar tech for Nirvana ended up buying this amp off of this guy because it was just kind of sitting around in this guitar shop and nobody was using it, and I think it was actually thrown away. And then the original maker of it bought it back after he found out that it was like just going to be thrown away or something, and he fixed it because there was something wrong with it, and then after he fixed it he sold it to Nirvana's guitar tech. So anyways, it was modified so that it's got this like natural overdrive that happens without turning up the drive knob, so it kind of like naturally overdrives without any pedals hooked up to it or anything. And I watched a YouTube video of a guy who tells this whole story about it and then gets a hold of the amp. He ends up buying it off of somebody and then plays it and then compares it to the other guitar amps that were suspected to be used on that album, and it sounds amazing. So the only thing is it's a tube amp, and I like solid state amps. So we're developing a dual clean channel guitar amp that mimics the orange guitar amps that I love to play, that I primarily play because they have a great punchy trebly tone. And then we're going to find a way to, so we're going to try to find a way to mimic the orange amps that I like, and then we're going to try to find a way to mimic that plexi amp that has a lot of the natural mids, because that was one of the really cool things about that album, is that the mids were really cool. So we're going to try to figure out a way to make it a dual clean channel amp that I can switch between those two tones and then just use my guitar pedals over it. Because I've been writing a lot of stoner rock recently, and I really think it would be cool to use a plexi modified clean tone along with a fuzz pedal. I think that would be the tone that I'm trying to accomplish in my head. So after we get back from tour, I'm actually going to be working on that with Jordan's dad. I'm really excited about that. Clint has actually gotten some amp shells for the amp head and the amp cabinet, and I'm gonna finally be able to build the amp cabinet that I've always wanted. Keelan, our guitar or our sound engineer essentially for the band, is also going to help me with the amp cabinet, because what we want to do is build a reverb unit in the amp cabinet, so it's in post, so it has a lot more clarity than if it was in the amp itself. Because if it's in post, it'll be connected directly to the speakers, so it'll come straight out of the amp and then into the speakers, and then this reverb unit will work with the speakers directly. We're trying to figure out a way to make it work, but it shouldn't be too hard because it can work just like a pedal, essentially. Like once we plug it into the input jack, it should be activated. We might have to find a way to like plug in a power source to the reverb unit. We're not entirely sure how we're going to do it yet, but I want to build a guitar amp, and this is part of the idea I had about 5 years ago, that has 3 12-inch speakers and then 2 10-inch speakers that are diagonal from each other in the top right-hand corner of the guitar amp, of the guitar cabinet. And the reason why I want to do that is because one of my favorite guitar players is Joe Walsh from the Eagles. And I remember whenever I was in high school, I watched a Guitar Center sessions with him, and he was explaining that he typically will tour and even record with just a 10-inch Fender Champ amplifier that's like, it just has a 10-inch speaker on it. And he says that if you're recording leads, you actually get a lot of clarity if you just use a 10-inch speaker. And the reason why he says that is because it's like the most precise tone that you can get from a speaker while you're recording. For him personally, he said he's tried recording guitars on these big amplifiers, and whenever he's doing his lead parts specifically, he just doesn't like the way it sounds except out of that 10-inch speaker. So I thought it would be really cool to do two 10-inch speakers, so if I want to have the option to get a different, more precise tone for guitar leads, I can use those two speakers and just mic those two speakers themselves in a recording session. So I'm really excited to start this idea, and I'm gonna try and document some of the progress on it. It's gonna be really expensive to make, but I'm gonna probably start buying stuff for it over the course of a few months and stuff. So, yeah, some really cool stuff happening in my life right now, and I'm really grateful. So, let's just see where it goes, I guess. But back to the book. So the book is it's called A Fiery Trial, and it's by Eric Foner. I posted a picture of it on the Instagram page, but it's about Abraham Lincoln, and it's about his life specifically, and it's more specifically about his policies as a politician, and a lot of the misfortune that he experienced in his political life. So, let's see. Abraham Lincoln was from a pretty small town in Illinois. I don't remember the name of the town exactly, but he was actually in his early 20s, technically an indentured servant to his father. So there was a period of time in American history where a lot of people were living on farmland, so their fathers would either sell their younger children like plots of their own land, or would teach them a skill so that they could build up money while they're young. This is way before any kind of labor laws, so they would build up money while they were young and then buy their own land by the time they were 18. But in Abraham Lincoln's case, his father owed a lot of debts. So in order for Abraham Lincoln to become a man and be out on his own, essentially, his father forced him to work kind of on his behalf to pay off his own debts. And in the book, Eric Foner kind of goes into some hypothesis as to why Abraham Lincoln would have developed his personal theories on the his attitude towards slavery. And at the time, Illinois was a pretty prominent slave state, but there was an undercurrent of change happening, and he ended up not being able to leave home until he was about 22 or 23, I think. And then he kind of like fumbled around, going from different job to job, not really knowing what he wanted to do, but he taught himself how to read. And then after teaching himself how to read, he became like a self-educated intellectual. And he found himself going into the profession of being a lawyer. Now, in America, being a lawyer was much easier. He ended up only going to like some kind of vocational school essentially to learn how to be a lawyer for about 3 or 4 months, and then took a test and became a lawyer. It was pretty easy back then to become a lawyer. Now, once he became a lawyer, he kind of floated around and ended up quitting being a lawyer for an extended period of time, and then went back to being a lawyer. And during this period of time, he doesn't write very much, so we don't know what his thought process is. There's also a story of how in his early 20s, he ended up potentially, suspectedly, sorry about that. I ended up getting a call for work. But anyways, so it was suspected that Abraham Lincoln had actually at one point gone to a brothel and used a different name, and then ended up like owing the prostitute money. So he ended up like having to go back and pay her a second time, or he might have been like banned from there at one point, or no, he ended up like meeting her later and paying her later. I think that's what it was. So, and it's on pretty solid evidence that happened. They ended up, like not, at least in Eric Foner's book, he said that they ended up not really investigating claims of the sort during his campaign to be a senator for Illinois. And that it was kind of one of those things that was like not really looked into, and there weren't even really any rumors about it. It was just something that happened in his early 20s, and back then, information wasn't as widespread, and he ended up like never going to that town again. So, yeah, it was never really found out exactly who it was, but so that was kind of interesting to read about Abraham Lincoln. I had never learned anything about that before, so I need to close this door. Okay, so what's really interesting though is that you see that he is a failed politician. He ends up becoming governor. I'm sorry, not governor. Senator in Illinois. Fairly young. I think he's in his like early 40s. It's like 1848. 1858. By the time he actually ends up leaving the Senate for the second time, because he took like a good 2 or 3 years off after he was elected once, and then he was elected again, and then in 58 is whenever he kind of decided that he didn't want to do politics anymore. And so he was thrust back into politics in 1860, after, he had taken those, like, I actually think it was, I think it actually was a longer period of time, now that I'm remembering it. Because he was elected senator, I want to say in like the early 1840s, and served one term. And then he didn't serve another term for, I think, almost like 8 years, actually. And then in 1858 is whenever he dropped out of politics again for the second time, and was just giving speeches on abolition, as the rest of the country was kind of working up tensions near the end of the 1850s. So he ended up being thrust back into politics, and his name had been thrown around as a presidential candidate since he got out of being the Senate. And see, he had a few different proposals for the economy, and actually shied away from talking about slavery and abolition for most of his political career. There's no records before 1958 or 1957. 1858 or 1857, where he mentions slavery at all. His main proponent was the economy. He wanted to reform the economic system in America. He had a few different ideas for relieving some of the agricultural stress put on farmers at the time, especially in the North and in Illinois, where he was from. And the economic bills that he was proposing were specifically for his state in Illinois. And so he was kind of a narrow politician, but he spoke very fondly in his diaries of an abolitionist named Henry Clay, who believed in gradual emancipation and gradual assimilation of former slaves into American society. So he began giving speeches in the late 1850s, essentially praising Henry Clay's view on the issue of slavery, as it became more and more prevalent in national and local politics in America, because there was a lot of unrest, and at this point the radicalist movement had essentially found its way into the Republican Party. And there's like a good 3 chapters in this book about the development of abolitionist sentiments within the Republican Party in America, and how they sort of found their way. And at the fall of the Whig Party in the mid-1800s, the Republican movement sort of spurred out of the fall of the Whig Party. And so Abraham Lincoln identified as a Whig, and then there ended up being like a new Whig Party that was created. And Abraham Lincoln was he wasn't necessarily like at the center, but he was part of the center for the movement of a new Whig Party. And then the development of the Republican Party in America. And so he was actually hated by abolitionists. There's so many articles that are written about Abraham Lincoln from abolitionists in New York, specifically the New York Times, that say a lot of mean things about Abraham Lincoln because he believes in gradual emancipation and not immediate emancipation. But Eric Foner does a great job of explaining perhaps his thought process in terms of becoming a aligned with Henry Clay, and a lot of it has to do with the economics. Abraham Lincoln did not. He wrote a lot about how he didn't believe that immediate emancipation was practical, nor was it legal. That he was primarily focused on the legal aspect of slavery in America because in order to emancipate slaves, he understood the necessity of states having to go along with it to prevent exactly what ended up happening, which was a civil war. And he goes into detail of explaining how once Abraham Lincoln was elected, within the first month, states started to secede, and you see the political climate crumbling around him. There are still delegates in Congress and in the Senate that represents the seceded states, and there's a lot of talks as to whether or not he will go in line with a lot of the abolitionists, and he continues to say that he's for gradual emancipation and cites a lot of Henry Clay's speeches in his own speeches. And so once he's elected, states immediately start seceding, and there's even a question as to whether or not Congress should even acknowledge the seceded states. And then as tensions rise even further, slaves start to rebel. Frederick Douglass starts to write papers essentially outlining the struggles of slaves. And then later on, probably like halfway through the war, Abraham Lincoln as president starts meeting with Frederick Douglass and kind of very visibly starts to shift his mindset on emancipation through his contacts with Frederick Douglass. And one of the biggest and most significant things that Abraham Lincoln did, and I'm going to try to condense it because this chapter in the book is like close to 50 pages long. It's pretty intense, but throughout the most significant thing Abraham Lincoln did was the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime declaration, and it was used so that the Union could enlist black soldiers into the Union Army. That's what it was specifically used for. And Abraham Lincoln had been drafting the Emancipation for the better part of a year before he actually gave the Emancipation speech, and essentially used it as a inadvertent executive order, because he didn't actually use it as a executive order. He used it as a wartime measure. And essentially what the Emancipation Proclamation does is it there were already fugitive slave laws that were being used as soon as the state started to secede. That was like one of the first things that was passed through Congress was the fugitive slave law, which essentially the North would not recognize fugitive slaves and would not return them back to their masters anymore. That was the reversal of the fugitive slave law through the courts. And then whenever that started to happen in local courts, that's whenever we see a lot of the violence start to rise up. And a lot of people don't know this, but before the Civil War, while Abraham Lincoln was not a politician, he actually defended a slave owner before being elected president. And it was during this period in which fugitive slaves were having to come back to their masters, and he actually defended a slave owner. And there's a lot of debates as to why he might have done that, but abolitionists hated him for it. And he essentially was trying to highlight the complexity of the fugitive slave law in free states, and he defended this slave owner in Illinois, his home state. So that's sort of the way that the Emancipation Proclamation was used. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was not popular at all on both sides. There were very few people that actually supported it, and it was primarily the abolitionists. So, with all of this information to this point, I'm pretty sure you can probably see that Abraham Lincoln is not a one-dimensional figure, and he ended up becoming president essentially by being a moderate, and was unintentionally put into the position that he was because the Civil War had not even started before he was elected president. But many states were threatening secession before he was elected president, and was actually calling for secession if he would be elected president. Now, I want to talk more about emancipation because there were a lot of other people within his own cabinet that were not in favor of it. And he asked for their advice a lot, and it was revised a lot over the course of about a year. And he almost used it once before he actually did use it, about 6 months prior, and it was mainly because of how bad the war had been going. The Civil War had done terribly for the Union until they started letting blacks into the army. And there were many generals that as soon as the Union allowed blacks and former slaves into the army, that essentially resigned immediately. Abraham Lincoln actually ordered for a few generals to be executed because they were returning fugitive slaves, even though he was instructing them not to do so. He changed his, major general in the war, I think, like 3 times before Ulysses S. Grant was actually finally given the position. So this was a very chaotic and angry time in American history, and I decided to read this book because of the fact that there's been so much talk in American society nowadays, and even more books are coming out about how we're already currently in a second civil war, and that it's, inevitable it'll happen at this next election, which I don't entirely agree with. And reading this book puts a lot of what's happening now into perspective, and it kind of makes me less worried that we're actually in a civil war or that we're going to experience one in our lifetime. And so going back to emancipation, Abraham Lincoln himself acknowledges that as soon as he emancipates the slaves in the early part of 1864, before the war has actually come to a conclusion, that it is not enough to ensure that slavery is ended in America. And he simultaneously, as he is drafting his final draft of the Emancipation, is petitioning courts in the South that have come under Union control, specifically in areas of Arkansas and Louisiana and parts of Tennessee. He is writing letters, essentially petitioning their local Congress, their state Congress, to pass an amendment that would allow slaves to be free, and then allow former slaves that served into the Union Army to be granted citizenship. So the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really do much, given the fact that there were already so many things in place that gave slaves an option to join the Union Army. But what it did do that was so controversial, legally speaking, which is what he understood, was it imposed a federal mandate in states that had seceded that were claiming that they were a separate country. So it would be almost like if you took England and Ireland, right, and all the conflict that happened between them over the centuries, and England passed this mandate in the midst of another war between Ireland and England that all Irish citizens that come from, Irish descent are now legally English. I mean, it's not an exact, example, but it's pretty close. So it's a really complicated situation, and there's a lot of people that call for Abraham Lincoln to not be reelected within his own party, and he does not have the support of a large majority within his own party for a short period of time. But what emancipation did is it really kind of affirmed the goal of the Civil War in his mind. And there were a lot of things that came to be at the end of 1863 and into 1864 that Lincoln himself was unsettled by in terms of the war, and there were many people within the Confederate government that were calling for a peace agreement after the proclamation, and essentially Abraham Lincoln single-handedly shut all of those down because there were multiple people in Congress and within his own party that wanted peace as well, and were actually urging him and were trying to talk to Confederate legislatures to try and end the war. More people died in the last year and a half in the war than had died in the war up to that point in general. And with the influx of troops into the Union Army periodically, it was literally the only thing keeping the Union Army from having a fighting chance. So, a lot of major battles in the war. This book does not go too much into the strategic war itself. It does mention some of the major victories in Louisiana and in Arkansas that gave the Union Army the ability to starve out the Confederate Army and control a lot of their supplies that led to the end of the Civil War. But kind of backtracking, also, this is what the book looks like. I posted a picture of it, but it's actually called The Fiery Trial. It's not A Fiery Trial, so I apologize for that. But it ends up being that Abraham Lincoln is reelected president literally as the Union Army and news of the Union Army becomes more strategically positioned to win the war. And there's really only one thing that can tell you, which is that until it was clear that there was going to be a winner to the war, Abraham Lincoln was not going to win re-election. And literally up into his death, his re-election was primarily just focused on securing the abolition of slavery in the seceded states that have now been reunionized. And he goes through the state legislatures to ratify the 13th Amendment that ends up being passed nationally, and then also include new rewritten state constitutions in the slave states to include that slavery is in fact illegal in their state. And Louisiana and Mississippi become the two really big holdouts. And so it's a really long and dense book, and I'm skipping over a lot of information. There's a lot of names that I'm not mentioning in the book, just because there's periodically side characters. But the book is about Abraham Lincoln and his development, and him and Frederick Douglass are kind of at odds with each other throughout pretty much his entire presidency. And it wasn't until the Emancipation that Frederick Douglass publicly said anything nice about Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln himself gave several speeches throughout the Civil War saying that if he could maintain the Union without having to address the issue of slavery, he would have preferred to do that. But this was something that was affecting so many states at so many times. And at the time of the Emancipation, there were still over 5 million slaves in the South that were enslaved. So the Emancipation, like I mentioned earlier, really didn't do a whole lot. And it was in this really gray area of being unconstitutional. And Lincoln himself knew that. But if you look at all of the things mentioned in this book and this progression, I have a new admiration for him specifically as an American president, specifically because of the amount of pressure that he was under. Financial systems were crumbling in America at the time. This book also mentions how certain countries no longer could trade with America, leading up to the Civil War and even during the Civil War, for fear that their ships were going to be raided or shot down with cannons. That actually happened a few times. This almost became an international conflict at one point, due to the Confederate Army trying to develop alliances for supplies with other countries. And the major battles in the war, I would really like to investigate further, because another reason why I read this book is because in college I actually did not get a chance to dive more into the Civil War like I wanted to, mainly because I took a lot of Roman history classes and learned about Roman military history, which was equally as interesting to me. But the battle of the battles that are the most significant are mentioned in this book, like the Battle of Antietam, Battle of Gettysburg, and the Missouri Compromise situation is kind of dived into a little bit more. The topic of this book actually focuses more on the border states than it does the slave states. So Maryland, Tennessee, North Carolina, West Virginia, I'm trying to think of others. Missouri, obviously. So it really focuses on those areas and the new territories in America at the time. But geographically speaking, the war kind of just took place primarily up and down the Mississippi River, which is pretty realistic for that time period. I guess Fort Sumter, a lot of like the coastal cities were involved due to some of the things I mentioned earlier. But Abraham Lincoln he was a true diplomat from the standpoint of he did not take an extreme view on hardly anything that he did. And like I mentioned, his primary focus was just on the economic system in America that he wanted to reform. And he did write about some of his early experiences traveling to New Orleans, and it's hypothesized through Eric Foner's analysis of his diaries that perhaps visiting New Orleans and seeing the slave trade in action there convinced him to take a different approach towards abolition as a politician. At this point, he would have already been exposed to Henry Clay in his writings, but self-educated, which was pretty rare, especially just coming from very humble backgrounds, being the son of a farmer. So, he definitely did struggle with depression. That's not mentioned in the book, but there's a few poems that Abraham Lincoln wrote that are actually pretty famous that I encourage you guys to look up. But yeah, overall, great book. And I am currently reading another book called The True History of the American Revolution. And I hope to do another review on that much sooner than this book. Because of how crazy my life was, it took me about a year to finish it. So this other one's not nearly as long, but it's basically an account of the American Revolution through the eyes of a British citizen that visits America and ends up writing it essentially from the perspective of Great Britain and being a British citizen before becoming an American citizen, and putting into perspective the American Revolution. And I think he writes this book near the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, like the early 1900s or like the late 1800s. I'm not exactly sure, but I've already learned a lot more in reading that book that I didn't understand about the American Revolution. So highly would suggest this book, The Fiery Trial, if you're interested in history. So many things that I wish I could talk about, but it would turn this into a much longer thing than I think is necessary. So, all right. Thank you.